it was my first time back to Kyiv in just under a year. And it was an amazing trip, actually. I think that you don't really understand what's happening in Ukraine unless you can actually visit the place and see for yourself what's happening on the ground. And when you arrive in Kyiv, the first thing I think you'll notice is that it's such a normal city, despite everything that's happening around it, and not far from there on the front lines. Uh, the city is so normal in so many ways. It's a large Central European city with people bustling around, going to work. It is so normal in so many ways until the air sirens go off, and people then generally follow the instructions of officials and go into shelters. So the first thing I would say is it's so normal seeming in so many ways, almost deceptively. The second thing I would say is the morale of the people of Ukraine is incredible, and the resilience is amazing. The ability to be able to go about your lives and to keep the country functioning, and to have such a thriving metropolis, which they know is critical to keeping the country going in a time of war. It's just inspiring. I had the chance for the first time to really walk around the city and see for myself. There's a giant memorial in the middle of the city for all of the fallen soldiers, and you you walk around and you just see the enormous amount of loss, yet the enormous amount of spirit the country has. And you just realize this is a country that is determined to enter the European Union. It is determined to be part of Europe and the transatlantic community. And it was just very inspiring, despite all of the challenges that they're facing. My trip was almost perfectly bookended between the revelations about the corruption scandal and the leaking of this 28-point plan. And so, to start, I would say, with when the corruption scandal broke out, I think people were genuinely appalled and were demanding greater transparency from the government, accountability. And it struck at a particularly sensitive issue also. So on top of the enormous amount of money they were talking about, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million in kickbacks and bribes, um, the sector involved was the energy sector, which is one of the most frequent attacks of Russian airstrikes, missiles, drones, etc. And the electricity situation in Ukraine is a very serious problem. And these contracts that the kickbacks are related to were linked to protection of these facilities from air attacks. So it really, really struck a nerve with the Ukrainian people. I think that for the first time, you really saw some uh, almost, I would say, unified demands for change in the way the government is operating. But I also think that this was an incredibly healthy reaction, because this is what differentiates Ukraine from Russia. People could say what they wanted, people could complain, people could demand accountability, and they got it, because within, I would say, days, if not hours, the justice minister and the energy minister had both been dismissed, and there were calls for significant change in the presidency, which is something that is actually very sensitive right now, because that's where the war is being run out of. Now, on the 28-point plan, I would say that, um, well, I'd be lying if I said that went over well. Obviously, it didn't. Um, my, when I saw that plan come out, my first thought was, this is a leak for probably Russian purposes. I don't know what exactly is going on the US side, but I don't think that this is a plan that's going to go very far. and I counsel my Ukrainian friends and colleagues and anybody that I was speaking to try to take a breath and see where this lands. And ultimately, that is what seems to have happened. It was basically the Russian starting point, which we've all known for a very long time, with some odd additions here and there that I was pretty certain wouldn't fly from the beginning. And so, as we've seen, this process has continued to evolve. And so, I think the Ukrainians, they're being asked to be extremely patient when their soldiers are being killed on the front lines. And I think everybody would like to see a conclusion to the fighting, but they want a just conclusion, and they will keep fighting for that. And I don't think that even I wouldn't take it for granted that there's any way that you could impose a peace on the country that it truly wasn't willing to accept. Always surprised, both positively and negatively, depending on the day. I think that I went into the position with Secretary Pritzker, having already worked a year on this on loan to Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg's office, where we were focused specifically on how to help Ukraine on the infrastructure front. So I went in with my eyes open as to the complexity of the situation. And I think that may have been one of the reasons why they wanted me to be on the team, is just for that continuity. The sheer complexity of this is hard to overstate. My former boss, Secretary Pritzker, used to say that the Marshall Plan was one country helping 16. And this is far more countries than 16 trying to help one country that is still fighting a war. So you're talking about an enormous amount of coordination among partners, and also a need to be sensitive to the fact that Ukrainians are almost fully at capacity right now. The government is working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to try to manage short-term issues of, making sure that the electricity grid is operating and that the train system continues, all of which continues, actually, to their enormous credit, I think. Medium-term goals, so trying to think about what happens the day after the war ends, and long-term goals for how do you rebuild this country in a way that prepares it for EU accession. So, I mean, the complexity of this it just can't be overstated. But that said, I think that one of the most, I think, surprising and positive things that I've seen is that despite all of the potential for tripping over each other and, for the US and the EU to be overlapping, I mean, we actually coordinated really closely in my time on the Special Envoy's office. And I think that we had a real effective system in place to try to avoid duplication. I will be honest with you, one of the biggest elements, one of the hugest advantages we had going into that was the presence of USAID, which was the biggest single development agency on the ground in Kyiv. And so the loss of USAID, which was providing a really unique set of technical assistance and capacity building to the Ukrainian government, that the loss is also enormous. And trying to compensate for that now, I think, is what the government of Ukraine is struggling with its partners. USAID also did a lot of the managing of coordinating subgroups on sectors, and that's all gone now. So we really shot ourselves as a country, the United States, in the foot, if our goals are to eventually realize a lot of private sector investment and development and opportunities for U.S. companies, because frankly, that's what USAID was helping to till the soil for. Now, I think that the most important element of all of this, though, is the human dimension. And one of the concerns that I have about this war, and also, let's just be honest, there are other horrible, horrible conflicts going on in the world that aren't getting, that didn't get necessarily all of the same amount of attention. There's this lack of a human element to it. And so when I was on the ground in July of 2024, we visited the Akhmadut Children's Cancer Hospital, which just 3 weeks earlier had been hit by a Russian cruise missile. This was and is the largest pediatric hospital in Ukraine. Many of the, most, I would say, of the children with cancer in Ukraine are dependent on it. The toxology building where children were getting dialysis, fortunately, they were evacuated in time, but it was completely destroyed. The building was horrifically damaged by cruise missiles. I don't understand for the life of me how anybody could even pretend this was a military target. But you go there and you see the spirit of these people. This hospital was up and running again within days because it had to. They didn't have a choice. And to see the courage of the kids that were facing not just cancer, but the possibility that their hospital could get blown up. Honestly, there's that human face of this was just so critical, because this isn't a video game, and this isn't something that you can do with satellites, blowing things up from space and watching the videos. And there's nothing antiseptic about this. These are human lives everywhere that are being destroyed. And I think that was a really important reminder for us why we were doing what we were doing. Obviously, one of the most important points is that the context matters. Ukraine, in terms of kind of where it was before the war, was already pretty modern, and so they were starting off at an advantage, I think, over, for example, a place like Gaza, which had been under sanctions and essentially isolated for over, almost or more than 2 decades. So, the context does matter, but I do think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn, and things that we can pilot in a context of Ukraine that will be useful and applicable and adaptable in other crises. I think the first thing is you can't wait for after the war to think about planning. And so while I'm not involved in the discussions on issues like Sudan or Gaza, my assumption, and with some basis in fact, is that there are serious discussions going on in international organizations and among donor partners on how this could look, what needs to happen. There isn't necessarily agreement on it, but the discussion needs to happen before the war ends, because you're going to need, this is a continuum. This is short-term, immediate emergency needs, like during a conflict or right after it ends. Medium term, just to kind of staunch the hemorrhaging and to help people come back. And then long term, what's the future hope? What do you aspire for this country or entity or whatever you're talking about in terms of reconstruction? So, you don't want to start thinking about this only after the conflict ends. So that's hard, because we're not always great at chewing gum and walking at the same time as a development community, as an international, in terms of foreign policy. The other thing I would say is it's really critical that local ownership be front and center. And I think this is a principle that we all sort of recognize and agree on, but it really is important. But what's also important, and I've learned this from Ukraine, is There are serious capacity constraints right now. These are not necessarily long-term capacity constraints. But we may need to think about how do we provide emergency surge capacity in the short term while we're upskilling people to fill those positions in the longer term. And this is definitely a problem in Ukraine, where so many of the most talented and educated engineers, architects, et cetera, are on the front lines fighting the war. And Ukraine is working very hard with the World Bank and other partners, including the Kyiv School of Economics, who I had a chance to meet with, to work on upskilling and training more engineers, et cetera. But this is going to be a need in any post-conflict context. You don't want to displace local people with internationals that are higher paid and end up making kind of a permanent career out of this. But you do want to meet that need in the short term and make sure that there's capacity building for the future. And then I think that one of the most important things that we're going to have to think about, and we definitely have been thinking about this in Ukraine, is you need some degree of strategic planning, because you can't do this. All of this is integrated. These sectors feed off of each other. Electricity grid, health sector, the education and schools, housing, transportation, all of this needs to fit together. So if you stovepipe these too much, you're going to end up with a lot of white elephants, projects that aren't useful. You need, and we've been working really closely with the Ukrainian government. This was certainly a big point of Penny's as well, on integrated strategic planning and what some companies would call master planning. That has some connotations in other countries of like a 5-year plan, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about integrating all of this into one process that creates project pipelines so that you know what your priorities are and what your needs are. And then I would say you can't neglect governance. Governance is absolutely critical. And obviously this is a forte of BCI's. It's something we've paid a lot of attention to. Reforms to make things to make processes more transparent, to make government accessible. The digitalization of the Ukrainian government is incredible. I would say far more advanced than in my country, the United States, or in many countries I've seen. And that digitalization, which is a lesson I think that Ukraine has been trying to absorb from countries like Estonia, which has also provided a lot of know-how and technical assistance to Ukraine, is really important, because that has inbuilt transparency and accountability put into it. And there are elements already of the Ukrainian government that that utilize those tools. Like they have the DREAM system for all regions of the country inputting projects into a common platform, so people see what the needs of the regions and the local government are, and then can prioritize them accordingly. Or Prozoro, which was something pioneered with help from USAID and other donors, to create a smooth and transparent procurement process. So there are definitely governance elements that are absolute. You can't neglect governance in this equation. And I think that's an important lesson we have to make sure to learn in any post-conflict context. These are not transactional relationships. The issues like, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, or for that matter, Gaza or Sudan, these have complex ramifications on the international economy, on farmers in Kansas, on machine workers in Ohio, in my country, and it certainly is applicable to Canada, the UK, Europe, etc. We have to figure out a way to make people understand what is at risk here. Because if Ukraine loses this war, and if Russia and China are able to start to set the standards for things internationally, if they are if we kind of give up this rule-based order that we've been promoting since the end of World War II, which has given us peace, which has given us economic prosperity in our countries, which we have tried, not always successfully, to expand as broadly as possible around the world, with albeit serious failures at times. There have been mistakes made. There's no question about that. But unquestionably, a predictable world order is better than the type of chaos and opportunism that is the alternative. How you make people understand what's at risk in the long term, when admittedly there's an affordability crisis in the United States and in many other countries. There are issues of inflation, concerns about energy prices. Well, energy prices, you need to think what's going to happen if Russia wins in Ukraine and is able to. I mean, there are all of these linkages and ramifications involved. So we have to figure out a better way to articulate that to our countries. We can't take for granted that people will just operate based on this is the right thing to do, or this is just morally correct. There's a balance that I like to quote Franklin Roosevelt struck between interests and ideals. And the fact is, you need to appeal to both in all of our countries in order to explain. You can't just take for granted that people want to do the right thing. People do want to do the right thing, but if they can't afford to feed their families, for example, they need to understand why this is important to that issue as well. Well, I think one of the biggest single issues right now is how Ukraine is going to plug its budget deficit, because Ukraine is balancing providing for its people and trying to keep its people in the country and make sure that there are that things are operating as smoothly as possible under the circumstances within Ukraine, and also fighting a war that is incredibly expensive. Although I will say they're amazing at innovating and doing it cheaply. So, I mean, if you want bang for your buck when it comes to drones or defense, defense equipment, things like this, I mean, the Ukrainians have really honed this. The big issue, though, is going to be their budget deficit. And I know that right now the European Union, I think today, in fact, is having some final discussions on a loan to the Ukrainian government using as collateral Russian assets that are being held mostly in Belgium. It's a hugely sensitive issue because it does have implications on other crises around the world. But the Europeans have worked very hard to find a good solution to this that provides liquidity for the Ukrainian government in the area, I think, of $140 million loan, collateralizing those assets. If everything goes as I think the European Commission is hoping it will, that will proceed. And there are some objections they're still working through. I think that there are also several benchmark elections in Europe that will be very important in seeing whether things start to become a little easier within the EU on issues such as renewing sanctions, which are absolutely critical for maintaining the pressure on Russia. And so those are some of the benchmarks I'm looking at in the coming months. I would also, I think that everybody's hope is that this war will end, but it will end fairly and justly for Ukraine. And unfortunately, nobody can predict when that will happen. But, right now, this is an endurance test between Russia and Ukraine. And I think the more pressure that can be placed on Russia's economy, which is finally starting to feel a bit of the bite, the more Russia's people can understand that in St. Petersburg and I almost said Leningrad, St. Petersburg and Moscow, that that this war is real and that their people are being touched by it and their children are going to have to start serving. So it isn't just pulling people out of the out of the East or out of the Caucasus and treating them like cannon fodder. When the war really meets those cities, I think things will start to change. But unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know when that's going to happen. I just hope it happens as soon as possible, because this is an absolutely senseless war and it should not be happening in Europe in the 21st century.